Hello, and thank you for tuning in to this informational broadcast brought to you by Springfield Public Schools and Focus Springfield Community Television. We are here today to talk with you about a very important subject, the Springfield Public Schools budget, and some of the challenges that the fiscal year 16 budget presents. We'll be joined by a couple of very special guests. Of course, Superintendent of Schools Daniel Warwick will be with us to talk about some of the top challenges, and we'll also be joined by Patrick Roach, Chief Financial Officer for Springfield Public Schools, who will walk us through the budget process and tell us a little bit more about the nuances that make up the nearly $450 million budget that causes Springfield Public Schools to operate. Please stay tuned. So, Superintendent, thank you for joining us here today on this informational broadcast for people to understand the budgeting cycle and what we're facing at Springfield Public Schools. So every year around this time, it's the budget cycle. I know that we are looking at a $16 million deficit at this point, and there have been several areas that you have been very vocal about in trying to make sure people understand what it would mean for our district. First of all, let's just talk about the Chapter 70 funding. And what that is and how that accounts for part of the deficit.
Sure. Chapter 70 is the main education funding that any urban district gets from the state. Most of our budget is the Chapter 70 funding because in all the poor urban districts, the local contribution is very low. Springfield, because of the economic situation here, barely makes minimum net school spending. Chapter 70 went up this year, but our increase was only 1.5%. So that was helpful, but given our fixed costs and the way those fixed costs are going up, and given the cuts that were made in the governor's budget in other areas, it's going to present a very difficult budget situation unless we can get some relief from the legislature.
Let's talk about some of those cuts. I know that one of the areas that a lot of people have been concerned about is a kindergarten grant that is proposed to go away. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, there's a grant that was put in place 10 or 15 years ago that actually gave us funding to implement full-day kindergartens in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, which we embraced and did right away in Springfield. We actually fund out of that grant paraprofessionals in every kindergarten because you really need a paraprofessional in every kindergarten class to meet the children's needs because we're talking about most class sizes from 20 to 25. So because of this $1 million cut in taking this grant away, right away, that's an extra $1 million that we're facing in a deficit situation, knowing that we probably need the paras in those classes. We're going to have to find a way to fund them, but it's going to result in cuts in the budget. So that was a $1 million cut by us not getting the grant. We're hoping that in the House budget and in the Senate budget, they restore that grant, because for the urban centers, that is a really tough situation for us.
So that's the kindergarten grant. Another area is charter assessment fees that Springfield Public Schools pays. We know that charter schools exist outside of Springfield Public Schools, so can you tell us a little bit about these fees? Yeah,
the charter piece is probably our biggest challenge that we faced recently. Right now, this year, our charge for charter schools went from $38 million in last year's budget to $44 million. So an extra $6 million right off the top in charter costs. The state only reimburses us a small portion of that. They cut back $2 million in that small reimbursement. So that presented an extra $6 million problem for us to add to our deficit. So again, we're hoping that the state will find a way, if they embrace charter schools, to not fund them on the back of our urban students in the poorest urban centers, because that's what's happening now. And it's a significant problem. This year, again, a $6 million increase in 1 year. And they're not even, again, properly funding the reimbursement they're supposed to give us.
Begin with.
Right. So that presents a huge challenge for us.
And a third area is what they call the circuit breaker, and funds going down in that area. What is the circuit breaker, and how will that impact us if it is cut?
Circuit breaker is a reimbursement cities and towns get to help us fund special education. Now, this particular funding source is about for students who are really high-cost students who cost to educate them are over $30,000, $35,000 per student. The state reimburses us a small portion of the part that goes over $35,000. So again, they should have fully funded special education. It was an unfunded mandate to begin with. Now they're not even giving us the reimbursement on the circuit breaker. They're supposed to fund it at 75%. They're only going to fund it at they're talking about 68% in the governor's budget. Again, that's another part adding to our deficit. Special education is a mandate that should have occurred in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, but it was an unfunded mandate. That's a huge problem. We shouldn't be taking away from regular ed students to provide services for special ed students. So it's grossly underfunded throughout the Commonwealth. It's a bigger problem in the urban centers where you have a higher percentage of special ed students.
So those are three specific areas: kindergarten, special education, and really with the charter assessments, that's from the general fund, so that impacts the entire district and student population.
Yeah, all of these funding sources have an impact on the entire district because we don't have, as we're making cuts, we're going to be looking at cutting every school if we don't get some relief from the legislature in these areas.
And the budget has been tight in so many previous years that a lot of the fat has already been cut. I know a lot of reorganization and restructuring at the central office level has occurred, and it seems that now this is one of the most difficult situations the district has faced.
My department heads at central office, as you know, are cutting 10% from all their budgets. This is on top of a 5% cut last year. We cut 22 jobs out of central office last year. Now we're looking at cutting more. We're not going to get through this situation without help, without cutting the school budgets as well this year. So we really need relief from the Senate and the House in this situation, and we're appealing to the legislative branch to help us in this situation because we're going to have dire cuts if we don't get some relief.
And is there anything that the general public can do? Is there their own elected representative that they can reach out to voice their concerns?
Great question, Azell. I think our legislative delegation, which we're reaching out to, the mayor is organizing a meeting to get our local legislative delegation reach out to their legislator and advocate for the students of Springfield. And this is a critical juncture. This is the most serious budget challenge we faced in the last 8 or 9 years.
Okay, all right. Well, thank you. It's sobering information, but it's good for people to know what we're up against and how they can help. So thank you for spending time with us.
And if I could just add to that, I think that this legislative reach out is really important this year because I think, you know, with a Republican governor, the legislature has a lot of ability to help us in this regard, and it's really important they step up this year and look at the budget needs and express their opinions on this. So our legislative delegation is just going to be key on this.
Okay, great. Well, thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Okay. So we're grateful for that information provided by Superintendent Warwick, and we hope you stay tuned now to learn a little bit more about the budgeting process and the budget itself. Shortly, we'll be joined by Pat Roach, Chief Financial Officer for Springfield Public Schools. And welcome back. Thank you for staying with us for this special informational segment on the Springfield Public Schools budget. As promised, we are now joined by Patrick Roach, who is the CFO, the Chief Financial Officer for all of Springfield Public Schools. Patrick, thank you for being with us today.
Thank you for having me.
My first question for you is, how large is the Springfield Public Schools budget overall?
Springfield Public Schools budget is approximately $450 million. We have over 5,000 employees, and out of that $450 million, it's made up of general funds that we get from the city and the state, as well as some money from grants and other funding sources.
What would you say is the what percentage is the highest amount of where the resources go towards financially? So in other words, is it what area, personnel or curriculum or just what?
The area where we allocate the most money is definitely to salaries. Salaries are over 70% for Springfield Public Schools, and of those salaries, the majority of it are in the schools. That's where all our staff are, our custodians, our teachers, our paraprofessionals.
We just interviewed with Superintendent Warwick, and we were talking about the last several years, how there's always been such a large deficit and a gap that needed to be closed, and how the emphasis had always been placed on central office so that the cuts would be made as far away from the classroom as possible. One of the things that we talked about was this year being extremely challenging. He said that while we have received a 1.5% increase due to inflation, our expenses far exceed that. And he talked about some fixed costs that are continuing to go up. Can you tell us a little bit about what he means by fixed costs?
Fixed costs, for one, health insurance is a big one for us. Health insurance is over $35 million. And this year we're going to have about a 5% increase in health insurance. And so what that means is if revenue is only going up 1.5% and the health insurance is going up 5%, we immediately have a budget gap that we have to solve for. Another one of those expenses is retirement. At this point, retirement's going up 11% this year as we're paying back and paying for pensions of people who retired a long time ago. That cost was never fully funded, and so we're on a funding schedule to, by about 2040, have us all paid up, but that forces us to pay more money into pensions for people who have long since retired.
I see. So those costs continue to exist every year, but not only exist, but to escalate in cost.
Yes.
Yep. Now, one of the things that you talked about was retirement and continuing to pay that. So if a person has retired 10 years ago, that's still being funded, that will be funded out of the FY16 budget.
Yes.
And that continues to contribute to the cost.
Exactly.
One of the things that the superintendent talked about was a circuit breaker. And it seems quite complicated. So maybe you can walk us through a little bit around what a circuit breaker is and specifically this year's budget as to how that is so important.
Circuit breaker is a source of revenue that we get from the state. It's to account for, it's to reimburse us for extremely high special education costs. And the way we receive money from the state, we get a per pupil amount for each individual student. Some of our students' expenses exceed $100,000, $200,000, and so
for a student.
For a student.
And that's because they require so many additional services?
Yes.
Special services.
Special services, sometimes medical services, sometimes special education services. A lot of them have disabilities, and the cost to provide them those services is extremely expensive. Many times they're not even served within the district, but we have to pay tuition to send them out of Springfield Public Schools to a resource that can better serve their needs.
So if the student lives in Springfield, but the district for some reason cannot accommodate their special needs, and they need to attend a school outside of Springfield, Springfield Public School needs to pay that tuition cost for that special school.
Yes.
And that's part of the money that we're looking at for this fiscal year that is potentially going to be cut.
Circuit breaker is a key component of how we actually fund those costs, because if you think about it, if we're only getting $20,000 for a student and we're spending $200,000 for a student, that money has to come from somewhere. So without circuit breaker to help fill that gap, it's really a type of gap funding. Then we have to take the money from other kids in other classrooms. It comes out of our regular ed classrooms and regular education supplies and athletics and programs of that nature.
And so that's why, although it's technically special education, the implications are district-wide.
Yes, yes. I mean, we want to serve all kids appropriately, and special education is a mandated service, and so that becomes our first priority has to be to put the money towards those kids with the services in their IEPs, and then we fall back and we have to make cuts somewhere else. So the circuit breaker is really important for us to have that money to be able to fill that gap.
And I'd love to be able to expand a little bit on charter school assessments. I know that the state is supposed to reimburse the district for money that it pays for assessments. Can you tell us about how that's been going and just how the district has to fund charter school assessments?
Sure. So charter schools, they take kids from within the city of Springfield and they attend a charter school, and basically the management of the charter school falls outside of Springfield Public Schools realm. What happens when the student attends is the tuition money we get from the state follows the student to the charter school because that's where they're going to be getting their education. The problem for the district is we still have fixed costs when those kids leave. If you're losing 3 or 4 kids from a high school, you're still paying for the principal, you're still paying for the utilities, you're still paying for the building, you're still paying for the maintenance on that building, you're still paying for the retirement for those people and the health insurance for the retirees that I had mentioned before.
Right.
And the state as promised gap funding for transition funding, I should say, for a few years. So in the first year, they reimburse you the full amount of that cost, and then in the next 5 years, you get 25% of that tuition back. And really what it's to do is it's to help the district manage that transition from the students leaving, because we're going to have to reduce our costs in order to deal with the kids and the money leaving.
So that sounds good. But what's the problem?
It's not being funded up to the levels that were committed to us. And so when in the governor's budget that was recently released, we're being shorted $1.8 million from that commitment. So, you know, that's the main thing Springfield needs to survive, is that $1.8 million helps us provide education to the kids that remain in Springfield. We need that money to provide our current kids services.
The other thing that we talked about with the superintendent that maybe we can elaborate just a little bit more on now is the kindergarten grant drying up, being taken away, and the cost the money that goes with that out of our district.
Yeah, so we receive a grant for full-day kindergarten, and in Springfield we have full-day kindergarten. Not every district has that, and you know, we use that grant to fund the paraprofessionals in the classroom. So in our kindergarten classes, we have 25 students with a teacher, and we put a paraprofessional in that classroom as well to support the teacher and to support the children, because that's a lot of kindergarten students for one person to manage. We receive this grant. It's about $1.1 million a year, and it helps us fund that operation to provide our kids that education. And kindergarten's critical in what we're trying to do with the early learning and early intervention.
Right, right. So those are three of the main areas that hopefully our conversation helped to clarify even a little bit more for our viewing audience on how important these issues are for Springfield Public Schools. And now with the few moments that we have remaining, maybe we could just talk a little bit about the process. I mean, a $450 million budget. How do you begin to take a look at what you have and what you need and figure out how those cuts will be made and where they will be made? Can you walk us through that just a little bit?
Sure. Usually in December, my team, we do some projections, try to figure out where we're going to be for next year, and we get a good idea so we can start kind of crafting a strategy on what we're going to do. But our process is usually pretty similar. And we go out to our cabinet heads and we ask them all to submit their budgets, with each cabinet head being responsible for a different portion of Springfield Public Schools budget. And they all submit us a budget, and this year we ask for 10% cuts from each one of those chiefs. And what in your office can you cut to help us balance this gap? And so my team goes back and they vet through all of the work we submitted, and we try to see if there's anything else that can be done as well. And we end up having hearings with the superintendent and the cabinet chief of that department. And we sit down and we kind of, you know, as you know, we put you to the test, and we try to see what areas we can either become more efficient on, what areas are no longer needed, and just anywhere we can find some savings to deal with that budget gap that we have.
And what about in the schools? How do they handle the budget process?
What we do for the schools is we do a staffing allocation. So basically, based on the number and type of student you have, and you know, grade level, things of that nature, we run the student counts through a formula, and it allocates staff to each one of the buildings. So if you have more special education programs, you get more special education teachers. If you have more English language learners, you end up with more ESOL teachers. And it's just a formulaic approach so that all of our schools are funded equally.
So it sounds like you start this process in the winter. What's the timeline? When is the budget finalized for the next fiscal year?
For this year, we sat down with the school committee, and our target date's April 30th. This year's a little different because with getting a new governor in Massachusetts, we normally get the governor's budget in the third week in January. However, this year we didn't get it until March 4th. So our timeline's very much more compressed than it would have been. You know, in Springfield, we're so dependent on state funding that we're kind of tied to the state's timeline. And the House budget will come out first, and we'll have a better idea on where we stand. And then the Senate budget will come out, and we'll really know where we stand at that point, and the conference committee gets together, and we'll know what's happening with the state funding. That's one of the things that's different for Springfield as opposed to some other communities is since a lot of our funding comes through the state formulas and we're funded at that minimum level, fluctuations in state money could directly impact our budget.
So when do we know for sure what the state's budget is going to be that we have to work with?
Could be as far as July. However, we'll have to pass a budget before that. When we have some really good estimations, you know, the goal would be April. However, late May, early June wouldn't be a stretch.
And is there any other sort of budget group that you work with that might represent the voices or concerns of different constituencies throughout the district?
One of the strategies we started a few years ago that's been very successful is we have a budget advisory committee. And it's a cross-section made up of cabinet chiefs, the superintendent, principals, and you know, some union representation, and it's a good cross-section of our district, the different stakeholders that we have. And you know, they're kept in the loop on, you know, the outlook that we're facing, and they're asked to be part of the solution of how we're going to solve this budget gap.
And I guess lastly, just about your team, I'd like to just ask you, it's a huge charge. How many folks would you estimate you have on your team?
We have a budget director and 7 financial analysts, and you know, they do yeoman's work on a regular basis. This time of year, everybody's working real late at night in order to get this done because we just have such a compressed timeline in order to you know, $450 million and trying to make sure every dollar is accounted for in the right bucket, projected appropriately. It's pretty important to making sure our kids get what they need. Absolutely.
As with any organization, budgeting is very important, but especially when you're talking about education, because it is the future of our children and it is taxpayers' dollars. And so it's a very critical component of Springfield Public Schools that we don't always get to talk about. We're always talking about curriculum and our students and our teachers, but this is how it all operates and how it all runs. So thank you for joining us, Pat, today. I hope that this session was informational for our viewers, and again, from that timeline that you talked to us about, it's very clear that there is still time for people to contact their local representatives, make their voices and their concerns known, especially as it relates to kindergarten funding, that circuit breaker, and the other very important one, which is the charter reimbursement. Exactly. So great, thank you. Thanks for joining us. I'm Azell Cavaan, Chief Communications Officer for Springfield Public Schools.
Thanks, Azell.
Thank you.
Thank you for tuning in to this special broadcast about the Springfield Public Schools budget. Be sure to contact your local representative and make your voices and concerns known. My name is Azell Cavaan, Chief Communications Officer for Springfield Public Schools. Thank you for watching.